Alright, this is going to be part 6 of the used car saga. In this episode, we're going to be replacing the transmission fluid and transmission fluid filter, as well as the gasket that goes on the transmission pan. First thing you're going to want to do when you do this is drive the car around and heat that transmission fluid up. That way it flows nice and thin when you go to change it. Now, since we've driven it around, we're going to pop the hood, and then we're going to go underneath the car and jack the car up. You want to find a sturdy part of the car. In this case, we're using the front subframe to jack the car up. And jack it up as high as you can, depending on how low your car sits to the ground. This one sits pretty low, this Ford Focus. So we're going to jack it up as high as we can and then put a jack stand underneath it. Now that we got the car jacked up as high as we can and a jack stand under a sturdy part of the chassis, we can go ahead and take a look at our transmission pan and see what we need to take off. From what it looks like, it's a bunch of 8mm bolts all the way around the transmission pan. One important thing to keep in mind is we're going to go ahead and loosen these, but you need to know which side, when your vehicle is jacked up, what side of the pan is lowest. Because what we're going to do is probably remove all these bolts right here on this side, move all these bolts over here, then loosen these ones and let as much of the fluid run out of the pan as we can before we take it all the way off. If you do it any other way, if you just take all the bolts out and pull the pan off, you're going to have 3, 4, 5 quarts of transmission fluid all over the floor, depending on how much transmission fluid your car holds. So I'm going to go ahead and start loosening these up, and I'll get back with you when we're ready to take the pan off. These bolts aren't torqued very high, so a 12 volt right angle is easy to get them off with. Set them off to the side, make sure you don't lose them. Okay, at this point we've got all the bolts removed except for one on each end. That's the low end, this is the high end. Now what we're going to do is on this high end, we're going to loosen the bolt about halfway and then take this end all the way out on the low end. So we can fit a screwdriver in the corner and let the fluid start draining while this bolt still holds the pan. That way it doesn't just dump fluid everywhere. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now we got this bolt loosened up here and this one loosened. So we can go ahead and wedge something in between the pan and the transmission and break the seal. Make sure you have something to catch this fluid because it will come out fast. Make sure you have it oriented just right. That way you don't get it all over the place or all over yourself. But this transmission fluid does look nasty. Probably never been changed. It's got 110,000 miles on it. There we go. Now what we'll do is we'll let that drain until it stops draining, then we'll take them 2 bolts out and carefully lower the pan. That way we can hold the fluid that's still in it and then pour it into the drain pan. So when this stops draining, we'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll check out the filter. Okay, now that we got the pan off, you want to inspect the pan. As you can see, there's some shiny stuff in there. That could be metal, that could be clutch material from the clutch disc, but there's not too much of it. Another thing you want to inspect is most transmission pans will have this magnet. This ring right here is a magnet, and it catches all that metal in your pan so it doesn't get circulated through your transmission. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some brake cleaner, clean this pan off, clean this magnet off real well, and then we need to take a razor blade and scrape the gasket material off, because I guess during manufacturing they put a RTV type silicone to seal this instead of an actual gasket. So we'll scrape that off, scrape it off the transmission mating surface, and then change the filter, and then we'll be ready to go back together. So I'm going to get this cleaned up, and I'll see you when this is clean, and we'll check out that filter. One thing I do want to mention before we check out that filter, after we have the transmission pan clean, if your transmission pan did not have a reusable gasket, what I suggest doing is putting some silicone like this, RTV, it really doesn't matter, this is what I have right now, ultra copper. But the size of this gasket and as many holes as that is in it, it's hard to get it to line up perfectly, especially when you're holding it and trying to thread bolts in while it's on the transmission. So what we're going to do is line it up ourselves perfectly and then dab some RTV on all four corners of it. That way it'll hold it, and while we're replacing the filter, it'll dry and set, and it'll hold it. But you don't want to use too much, because RTV is about the worst thing that can get into a transmission. I suggest putting it on the outer edges just a little bit. That's all you need. That right there is as much RTV as you want to use. Just smear it on there, that way it dries faster and it'll hold the gasket. But I can't film and put the gasket on at the same time, so I'm going to put that on real quick and show you what it should look like. Once you get the silicone on, just line the holes up. They might not line up exactly, but you can fiddle with it enough until you'll get it just right. Like I said, there is a lot of holes, and it's hard to keep one side of line while you do the other and vice versa. But now let's check out that filter. This right here is your transmission fluid filter. Now, not all of them will have an electrical connector like this, but this one simply pulls down and off, and then your transmission fluid filter will just pull out like that. And be ready, because more fluid will come out of the transmission. Now we can go ahead and place the new filter in there. And the new transmission fluid filter does have an O-ring on it. Just take some old transmission fluid and rub it around that rubber O-ring, and it should produce a good seal. Remember the orientation that the filter came out, so you can put it in that way. Sometimes they'll also have, see, this one has a guide pin, and it goes in that hole. So press the new filter up and in till it sets. Replace your electrical connector in the filter. Now we can go ahead and put the pan back on. So I'm going to get the pan on, thread in some bolts, and then we can fill it up. Once you have all your bolts back in, the pan on the transmission, you got them all hand tight. You need to torque them to spec. This car, the torque spec's 10 foot-pounds, so we got our torque wrench set for 10 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go around and torque all of these to 10 foot-pounds. So when we're done with this, we'll fill the transmission up. Now that we got all the bolts torqued on the transmission pan, what we need to do is lower the car and remove the jack stand, then we can start filling the transmission back up with fluid. Now we can go ahead and start filling up our transmission. And in the manual, it says this transmission takes 5.4 quarts of fluid, and we lost about 3 quarts putting it in, or removing it, sorry. So what we need to do, the only way to fill a transmission is through the dipstick tube. So you need to remove the transmission dipstick, and you need a long funnel with a long neck like this, so it'll fit in that hole, and we can fill it full. And I only recommend using OEM fluids from the OEM manufacturer. This is a Ford, so we're going to use Ford Mercon transmission fluid. So we're going to go ahead and put about 2 quarts in there. Then we'll start it up, roll the transmission through the gears. That way, circulates the fluid through the transmission, then we'll check it. The only way to check transmission fluid is while the engine is running and the car is in park. So we're going to go ahead and pour some fluid in there, about 2 quarts worth, and then go. And I only recommend using OEM fluids from the OEM manufacturer. This is a Ford, so we're going to use Ford Mercon transmission fluid. So we're going to go ahead and put about 2 quarts in there, then we'll start it up, roll the transmission through the gears. That way, circulates the fluid through the transmission, then we'll check it. The only way to check transmission fluid is while the engine is running and the car is in park. So we're going to go ahead and pour some fluid in there, about 2 quarts worth, and then go. Now we need to start the car up and roll the transmission through the gears. What we want to do is go from park to reverse and hold it, park to neutral, or sorry, reverse to neutral, then neutral to drive, drive to second, and then second to first, and then go back up. The engine should be running while you're checking the fluid. That way it's circulating. As you can see, we need to add some fluid. It's about at the bottom hash mark. Once you've selected through all the gears and checked your fluid and added fluid when you need to, and you get to the in between the 2 hash marks on your transmission fluid dipstick tube, your repair is complete. You've changed your transmission fluid, your transmission fluid filter, your transmission pan gasket, and you know that your transmission fluid is good to go for thousands of miles to come. But that's the end of this repair. If this video did help you, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, like and comment, and I'll be back with more car repair videos.